Welcome to the bonus show. This is not the Weather Channel. This is also not Fox News. When Donald
The David
Trump
Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Effectively turned into the Weather Channel over the last few days, choosing not to talk about Donald Trump's scandal after scandal, but instead just talk about Hurricane Matthew. But there is a really interesting political story that has resulted from this hurricane. There has been a vote that had in Colombia lower than expected voter turnout across the country. And it was a sort of referendum vote to ratify a peace accord with FARC. And this is arguably one of the most important votes in Colombia. Some people are saying in decades, but only 13 million of 35 million eligible Colombian voters actually showed up to vote. And there is every indication that if it were not for Hurricane Matthew, which brought huge amounts of rain, soaking the entire Caribbean coast and now actually affecting the United States, the math that says that the yes vote may have actually won by 90,000 votes. Unfortunately, the no campaign won by 53,000 votes in a 50.2 to 49.8 victory over yes. And when you consider the dynamics of the country and how the populations expected to vote yes or no were differently affected by Hurricane Matthew, a Category 5 hurricane, there's a very, very good case to be made here that the hurricane was responsible for one of the most important votes in Colombia in decades going a different way. And we talk here in the United States about, on election days, particularly for rural voters, if the weather is bad, November, there's already snow on the ground in much of the United States. If you consider swing states where there could be snow in November, Ohio is an example. And you think about, well, what voters are more likely to be disproportionately affected by bad weather? Certainly, people who don't have their own cars and rely on public transit could be more affected by bad weather on election day. Individuals who live in particularly rural areas might be disproportionately affected by bad weather. Senior citizens could be disproportionately affected by bad weather because they may be relying on family members or friends or public transit as well to get to the voting booths. And here we see in Colombia an example of where this actually seems to have made a difference. What do you think, Rachel? I mean, do you walk, drive, take public transit when you vote?
I normally borrow my mom's car.
Right.
So I think that the weather would have to be pretty terrible for it to actually deter me from getting out there, even though I'm pretty confident in Massachusetts. However, if I was in a swing state, I might be worried. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that people who live in coastal cities in the United States, when we hear, wait, how would bad weather prevent you from voting? I mean, even if there were 2 feet of snow coming down from the sky, I live 3 blocks from where I vote. I would just put on boots and walk over there. And I think that that's what's so interesting about this, that some people say we have 2 countries in the United States. Some others say that we essentially have like 5 or 6 different countries in the U.S. Really, the voting experience is so different if you live in a northeastern city. I kind of feel, I don't know if spoiled is the right word, Rachel, but certainly there's some privilege involved with being able to say, no matter what happens, I'm going to be able to show up and vote.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a privilege there, so to speak, but I don't know how they would kind of redirect where the voting takes place in certain rural areas to kind of maximize efficiency of getting people there if the area itself is rural. That's the problem.
No doubt about it. And of course, we also know this relates to voter ID also. We've talked about how sometimes right-wingers will say, why can't everybody just have an ID? The IDs are free. Well, kind of. But if you imagine living in a rural area in Mississippi, for example, and it could be an area that is overwhelmingly African-American, overwhelmingly Democratic voting, and overwhelmingly poor, in order to get that free ID, you would need, in many cases, number one, to obtain a copy of a birth certificate, which is not free to obtain, and you might need to figure out how to get to the hospital that has it in order to pick it up. That could cost money. Then you need to get that birth certificate and you need to go to the local DMV, RMV, Registry of Motor Vehicles, as it may be called in that state, And that might be 50 or 60 miles away. And if you don't have a car, you now are incurring additional costs just to go to where you're going to get this so-called free ID. And our report exposed that free IDs can cost anywhere from $10 to over $100. And that all relates to this issue of voting rights, rural areas, etc. So really, really interesting story from Colombia that really makes me think a lot about the voting dynamics here in the United States. Tomorrow on the program, I'm going to answer an audience question about homeopathy, chiropractors, and osteopathy. This is not really a preview, but it's about osteopathy. Rachel, really interesting story you have here.
A Pennsylvania-based osteopathic doctor has been charged with distributing drugs that caused a fatal overdose, conspiracy, money laundering, and bankruptcy fraud. William J. O'Brien, he had offices in Philadelphia and New Jersey. He built a massive pill mill, and he was illegally selling hundreds of thousands of opioid pills at large profits. He was originally charged alongside his assistant with conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. That was until prosecutors unveiled their 139-count indictment against the doctor, his ex-wife, and 8 members of the Pagans Motorcycle Club who were closely linked with his huge debaucherous pill mill.
Yeah, but I mean, motorcycle clubs, they're actually pretty good business partners because they don't take any crap from anybody.
Right. So all of his co-defendants pled guilty, and the doctor himself was given 30 years in prison and over, I think, $340,000 in restitution. So this is how their pill mill would kind of work. Members of the motorcycle gang would recruit patients who would pay for things like methadone and Xanax, and then the doctor would go on to falsify medical records, and if they didn't have enough money to pay in a very classy way, he would trade drugs for sexual acts.
Of course.
Yes. So what set this apart, though, was kind of the scope, because I think it was a little under 3 years. They actually took in about $5 million, and week by week they would maybe be taking in about $20,000. So I think that the immense scope is definitely what kind of sets it apart from other pill mills. And how they were caught is undercover FBI agents recorded the physician selling pills for unnecessary reasons. So a lot of questions kind of come up here to me. There's a lot of nuances. I don't understand how he got involved with the motorcycle club. It sounds like a plot of a movie. I'm wondering if he was maybe mentally ill. I know he was behaving erratically during the trial, and he was saying, I'm a doctor and I know practice makes perfect, but this was a practice and it wasn't perfect. Which is
odd guy in general.
Right. That sounds like a really good way to defend yourself, though. You go in front of a jury and you say, listen, practice doesn't make perfect. So I'm sorry.
There's
I don't know
nothing
what
better
I did.
than puns to get yourself off of legal charges. Yeah, the whole pill mill thing is crazy. And I actually don't think, I know there's a lot of people who are very touchy about critiques of osteopathic people with osteopathic degrees rather than MDs. But really, as I'll talk about tomorrow, since the 1920s, the osteopath world has by and large been on the evidence-based side of medicine as opposed to homeopathy and chiropractors, but we'll get into that tomorrow. The pill mill thing is a major, major issue. And the other day I was at a wedding in Cape Cod, and Cape Cod has a big, big opiate problem, as does a lot of Massachusetts. And I pulled up, and near my hotel, there was a little, very Cape Cod looking building, just a small structure with a door and a couple windows. And it said something like pain management clinic, and the building was dilapidated. And the second I saw that, I knew this is one of the places that always is, that often eventually falls prey to a sting operation, because it just looks so shady. This just doesn't look like a reputable medical establishment. And it seems that this guy, Rachel, was running that, except way bigger in scope.
Right. And I think the fact that there was one fatal overdose is just incredibly disheartening to me. And I also just think that he was kind of perpetuating the opioid crisis, and that definitely does not sit well with me. I think, again, that definitely goes back to the sheer scale and scope of his operation. Very strange with the motorcycle gang as well. Seems like a very weird group of people.
Yeah, this seems like a mix between, I don't know, what TV shows? I guess ER and Sons of Anarchy or something like that, combined with I mean, I don't know. It's sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, and this is one of those cases, much like the entire Donald Trump campaign, where if this was turned into a TV show or a movie script, it would seem too over the top to even believe. But sadly, particularly for the victims of this entire scheme, it is all too real. Going from pain pills to chess, there's a chess story that has really been making headlines that is interesting to me, and I know you took a look at it also, Rachel.
Yes. So one of the most successful female chess players says she will be boycotting February Women's World Chess Championship in Iran because the players have to wear hijabs. However, this is actually not completely correct. The website itself has said that they do not have to wear hijabs, so instead she is actually protesting the law in general and what she feels it is an infringement to women's rights.
Right.
So as we all know, Islamic coverings are required in some areas like Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then, however, there's kind of the opposite end of that spectrum with certain bans and restrictions in public in Turkey and France. So it's kind of a dichotomy there. And so she launched a campaign on change.org for a relocation of the championship, even though chess has some really deep roots in Iran, and a lot of people are saying this is a really important event for them, and it brings a lot of positivity, and so she's getting a lot of pushback for that as well. So it's kind of a multifarious subject, so to speak.
I didn't know that Iran had this big chess background.
Yes, it does. And another thing that's interesting is that the petition has actually been signed by more than 3,000 people. So again, there's people on both sides of her petition, so to speak. And Iran was the only country that submitted a proposal to host the event, and there were no objections from any of the 150 national federations. Do you think this is an infringement on freedom of choice? Do you think she's in the right here and the wrong? What do you think about her?
Well,
her
I am
stance?
against the hijab. So in other words, I mean, my views are, it sounds like they are saying you are not required to wear a hijab. I completely respect the decision to say, even if it's not required per se at the tournament, I am going to choose to not go in protest of what I see as a practice that is oppressive to women. I believe it is oppressive to women, but I don't think anyone is in the right or wrong. I mean, this is of course the right of any chess player to say I'm not going to participate, and it could be because you don't feel like taking the flight to the country, you don't like the food in the country, or you don't like one of the practices in this particular case. My confusion is that I have two different friends, female friends from Iran, one whose father is from Iran, the other is from Iran. One of them said, you really don't have to. There are really no situations where you absolutely have to be covered. And my other friend said, no, when I went, I had to actually cover myself, that she had a layover in London and had to cover herself in London before even getting onto the plane to Tehran. So I'm not totally clear on the definition of it is required that women are covered. And I don't know if this applies only to women who are related to Iranians or are Iranian. I just don't know exactly what the specific regulations are. I've heard sort of conflicting stories.
Right, because it's I think usually it's just in public places.
Right.
But the interesting thing also about what they said on the website is that it's not required to wear a hijab, is that I don't know if they're dancing around it a little bit, because they also said that participants are required to respect local traditions.
Yeah.
So I think that language was probably what dissuaded her.
That's pretty problematic language.
Yeah, it's definitely problematic language. However, I haven't quite decided how I feel about the other end of the coin, which is people saying that the hijab in general, the burqa, so to speak, are actually the opposite. It's the opposite of women's oppression, because when women are so often viewed for their sexual charm, this actually kind of not redirects it, so to speak, but it dispels it, because when you're completely covered up, that is taken out of the equation.
So what you're saying is the argument is, if a woman is completely covered up and indistinguishable in every way from every other woman that's around, all of a sudden men will be able to see them as people rather than sexual objects.
Right, and it shouldn't have to take that as well, but that has been an argument that I've seen in relation to her argument about not going to Iran.
It's not striking me as a particularly persuasive argument, although I understand, I've heard it made before, and I understand it is an argument that's made. It doesn't strike me as particularly persuasive. Excellent stories. Send me your thoughts, and of course, any recommendations for bonus show stories, send them along and we'll talk about them.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.